to do Ajax. That is, having your front end communicate with your back end and your front end doesn't have to reload. This is of course not unique to Django, but one of the things that you might be wondering is, how do you actually have your back end initiate something with your front end or some sort of communication with your front end? How does that happen? Now, this is all done using WebSockets, and we can do it asynchronously using Django channels. So asynchronously doing WebSocket communication with Django channels and Python 3.5 and above. That's what we'll be doing in this one. So let's go ahead and jump in. What you see right here is the absolute requirements to get this going. And I'm also going to assume that you're not a beginner in Django. If you are, proceed at your own risk, especially if you're using a different version of any of this stuff. Now, what I also recommend that you do is go to GitHub right now and go through the recommended start. If you go through that recommended start, it will get your code exactly where our code is at the start of this video, and that way we can all work on the same thing. Things will change over time, and this is a way to ensure that they're not going to change for you while you're working through the video. Now, of course, like always, use the documentation as reference when you need. So let's go ahead and jump into our code. Now that we've done the recommended start, I'm going to go ahead and integrate channels into our project, and I'll give some extra context that sure, it is in the documentation, it's in the installation portion, but I'm also going to do something that's a little bit closer to being ready for production. So pip install channels 2.1.2. Yes, you can use a different version. Just stick with the docs if that happens. I don't recommend it because, yeah, things happen when you use different versions, and that's not really the point here. The point is to understand how channels works inside of Django. So pip install 2.1.2, and it'll install all these other extra stuff that we need. Really cool. I love that about Python. Okay, so now that we've got this, let's go ahead and bring in channels into our installed apps. Okay, and channels, there we go. Now, if I go ahead and run python manage.py, migrate, of course, certain things might happen here, but the main thing is I want to go ahead and run the server. Now, I don't have an ASGI application set. So right off the bat, Django channels has taken over my run server command. So keep that in mind. If your third-party packages use run server for some reason, Django channels might not play well with them. So it is because it's a major departure, and the fact that it's doing this has to do with a lot of things related to the asynchronous code, but also how the WebSockets work. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's going on under the hood that means that we absolutely have to set our ASGI application. So what that means is that I have to create the routing for my ASGI. So in other words, we have to create routing.py. Now I'm going to go ahead and go off of their documentation for now and create that. So new file, routing.py, and we paste this in here. So back into our settings, we want to declare our ASGI application. And I'm going to put it right next to the root URL conf because it's very similar to our URLs, because that's essentially how you're doing it. This is the routing, much like URLs is routing. This is routing for WebSockets and worker processes, all of that stuff. So I'm just going to go ahead and do CFE home, obviously the name of my Django project's settings module or configuration model. And there we go. So now that we've got that, I can go ahead and run the server again. And as you notice, the actual run server is now using an ASGI development server. It's no longer using the WSGI. The difference is here is WSGI is like Web Server Gateway Interface. That's what it stands for. ASGI stands for Asynchronous Web Server Gateway Interface. And since we have that, we might as well do the production ready stuff for that, and that is setting asgi.py and actually bringing in a actual pretty much ready to go ASGI command that would allow our application to run. So you absolutely need this when you go into production, so you're no longer using the WSGI, you're now using the ASGI module itself. that is for production. It's a little bit, again, we're trying to do a little bit of a shortcut here and getting things going as quickly as possible. So then our WSGI application stuff, we don't actually have to worry about that really, right? So that's not something that is in of our concern anymore. I mean, we will keep it there, but I don't actually think we need it any longer. Especially when we go live into production, I'm pretty sure we don't actually need that any longer. Okay, so we have the basics of our Django project or the Django channels project portion integrated. So now it's just a matter of adding in some routes, doing some consumers, and talking about all that. So stay with us. So now what we need to do is create a consumer, somewhere that our WebSocket can communicate with channels. So think of consumers to channels like views are to Django. So these are asynchronous and they can connect with our WebSockets, but they can also connect to worker processes. But in this case, we are just going to be using the WebSocket related stuff. So let's go ahead and do it. We're going to first off import Async IO, which is a built-in Python library that allows for asynchronous code. Then we're going to import JSON, and then from django.contrib.auth, we're going to import the getUserModel method. We're going to come back to that one later. And then we're going to also import from channels.consumer, import async consumer. And do note that I have consumers inside of the chat application itself. They don't necessarily have to live there, much like views don't have to live in an app. This is just a recommended method. Okay. Then the next thing, the final thing that we'll import from third-party packages is from channels.db. Import database sync to async. And then finally from .models, import thread and chat message. So if you haven't looked at it already, definitely look at those models for those threads and those chat messages. We'll basically be talking about how they work in a minute, or when we actually work through them. But for now, let's just focus on the consumer itself. So we make a chat consumer as a class that inherits from the asynchronous consumer. So I'm going to copy and paste some code here in just a moment, but what I want to talk about is writing a function inside of a class. So it's a method, a class-based method, and something like WebSocket _ connect. And what the parameters are going to be self and event. So what we're going to do is we're going to print out connected and the event. Cool. So this is a synchronous method that runs in our thread as normal. What we want to do is turn it into an asynchronous method so it actually can be run and other things can happen too. So they kind of happen at the same time, or one can wait on another one finishing and still do other things. It's not necessarily stuck. So if you're not familiar with Async IO or asynchronous coding in Python, this is a little tricky, so just bear with me and run through it. So we'll go ahead and do async. That turns it into asynchronous code. You just write out async in front of it. And again, this is Python 3.5 and up. It's built in. We just write async, and importing async IO ensures that async will work. I believe in future versions of Django, or rather Python, we won't have to do that necessarily. Okay, so we've got our chat consumer here with this one method called WebSocket connect. So what this does is it allows us to have our WebSocket connect to this consumer. And we also have a couple other methods that we're just going to bring in as well. That is receive and disconnect. So these are three different methods that a WebSocket has, and hopefully it makes sense. We've got the connection, we've got when it receives something, so when it should respond to something, and then finally when it disconnects. Because since it's not a view, since it's not like, one request coming through, it's multiple events that happen when it's connected. So normally when you go to a view, you got a request coming through, and then you can handle something with that request and return a response. Consumers or WebSockets, and more specifically channels, don't work that way. I mean, sometimes it works that way, but a lot of times it doesn't. Like a WebSocket is a good example of that. because a WebSocket and that page can connect and disconnect at the same time. Like it could happen. Like, so errors can happen on the page where it disconnects, or your internet disconnects and then it needs to reconnect. All of those things can happen with WebSockets. It's really, really cool that it allows it to reconnect to it without the page reloading or refreshing or rerunning the server. All of those things can absolutely happen with WebSockets, and that's why there's multiple events. So that means that we can handle all this different stuff. This stuff will make a lot more sense once we actually bring it into JavaScript. But for now, we've got just this basic chat consumer. And since I've got that, I want to bring it into my router, which I'll do in just a moment. So if we look at our Django URL patterns, we see stuff like this, right? So we have path, regular expression path. Those are obviously Django 2.0 and up related stuff, but we can also use our old school one from previous versions of Django, so django.conf.urls, import URL. You could also do that as well, right? So what's happening here is we are building URLs that are related to an HTTP request. Each one of those URLs is then consumed by the view. We have to do something very, very similar with our consumer. So I said before, consumers are to channels much like views are to Django. So the consumer itself, we have to actually create some routing for it. Now, there's a lot of different layers to this in the sense that you can divert from what I'm about to do, but for illustration purposes and to actually understand what's going on, I recommend that you don't. So stick with us and let's open up routing itself. I've got these things imported. If you don't have these imported, just pause right now, go through it. We're going to talk about these things. So what it's doing here is I have the ability to write my URLs in here. Now, I'm not actually overriding my regular HTTP methods. I'm not doing anything with that. All I'm doing is WebSockets. And you may know WebSockets are a different protocol than HTTP. So we can actually open up a WebSocket and a standard HTTP connection and have them work together. That's completely okay. And Channels actually handles this for us, and it does it really, really well. And that in part is because of this asynchronous code, but it's also in part of how Channels has been created. It's really, really good. Okay, so now that I've got this protocol router, what I need to do is I need to declare what this is. So we're using WebSockets. Okay, so WebSockets means that that's the method that I'm using, and this is what it is named. So stick with this value for the WebSockets. If you try it with something different, it might work, but it also might not. For sure, WebSockets will. So the next thing is we want to do allowed hosts origin validator. So this right here is going to wrap around our WebSockets, and all it's doing is making sure that whatever host is doing the request or whatever domain name is doing the request will match the one that's written in here, or the ones. In this case, I have all of them being accepted, but much like with our URLs and cores, we would not want to have other hosts that aren't ours or that we have allowed, right? And that's what this does. It does it for our WebSockets in particular. This is in lieu of whatever is on our settings, right? So we can change that by using the origin validator. So we can have specific origins for just channels by using the origin validator. So look at the documentation for that. But that's pretty cool. The next thing is the auth middleware stack. So do you want the user or the requested user to be inside of your WebSocket? Do you want to be able to access that user? And my answer is pretty much always yes, for WebSockets in particular. In some cases, you might not need to, but for ours, we absolutely need to. And this wrapper allows that to happen. So this class is allowing it to happen. And what you see here is actually very similar to middleware. And it's just middleware for the routing or that specific route. It doesn't have to be on all of them, but it is for that routing. So it's just adding, like I said, that check, that security check, and then also allowing us to get what user is being requested. This is very important. The next thing is we use this URL router, and then we put in a list here. So what we have here is all of the channel related stuff. Inside of this list, it's actually going to be very similar to a standard URL. So like this RE path, it's roughly that same thing. Except of course, instead of RE path, we're going to use URL. right? So the configuration URL. You could probably use REPath. That probably doesn't matter. But as far as the documentation is concerned, it has been URL just like this. And then we want the actual path that we're going to be using. We'll take a look at that in a moment. And then, of course, as our chat, we want to use the chat consumer. And we don't do it as view. We just write chat consumer. And that's it. This is now our WebSocket URL. But the challenge with this right here is that means that our WebSocket connection is going to be something like this. Our domain and then username. Okay, and I don't actually want that. I want it to be related or identical to how the routing for my actual chat message looks like. So let's go ahead and comment that out for a moment. I'm going to save everything, and let's make sure that we don't have any errors. No errors, okay. And back into my project, I logged into the admin, and then I went to messages, and then my user. Right, so this is actually a form, and it actually does create messages. All of that works, and this is all just standard Django stuff. I could change it into Ajax if I wanted to, but right now it's just a Django form, Django views, all of that stuff's handled. It works just fine. So if we look at the URL, what I want to do is route my chat WebSocket URL to match my Django view that's going to render out the thread itself. So it renders out all of my previous messages. That's actually, I think, really important for this, is to make sure that we have the ability to match those things. So I just want to change this to being messages, in other words, right? Just like that. So messages and the username is the thread that I'm going to end up using. And then I can also put a $sign, close off the regular expression like that. That last part's not 100% necessary, but now we actually have done our routing. So we need to start working with our front end to make sense of all this, to actually put it together, because we've done most of the things that we need to do to at least start with what the front end does, and we probably won't have to do a whole lot with the front end after the next video or the next portion. Stay with us. So in this one, we're going to create our JavaScript WebSocket to connect to our backend. So the first thing that I want to do is just go ahead and say var socket equals to new WebSocket. And we use capitals here. Okay, so in here, we're going to have to put an endpoint. So I'm just going to go ahead and say var endpoint. And I'll just leave it empty for just a moment. Okay, so yeah, if you know ES6, you can absolutely use that syntax. I'm just keeping things nice and simple and easy for the rest of us that aren't that familiar with JavaScript. So just stick with me on this for those of you who are a little bit more advanced in JavaScript. So there's a couple methods that would come in with this socket. Socket.onMessage, socket.open, or rather onOpen, socket.onError, and then finally socket.onClose. Okay, so these different functions are events that happen for our WebSocket. They are related to how our consumer handles any given event. Although these are the JavaScript side. This is the client side. And WebSockets aren't only done in JavaScript. You can do it in other languages or other front-end technologies as well, and it would probably be very similar to this. So the first thing is on message, right? So we want to say, like, once our socket receives a message, that is our client side WebSockets receives a message, what do we do? Well, I'm going to just, first of all, just put in a function that would handle that, and we'll just do console log message and then E. Okay, so I'm actually going to copy this and put it on each one. All right. And change it to open, error, and close. Okay, so let's save that, and let's go ahead and look at our thread itself. So if I jump into Chrome, I see that I've got my servers running, and I actually logged into the admin. This is important because I didn't create auth-related stuff other than the admin. So I logged in the admin so I can actually see a thread. I refresh in here, and if I look at the JavaScript console with Command-Option-J, I get this error, WebSocket, the URL is invalid. So we can't have an empty URL. In other words, this endpoint has to be something, Like we actually have to send it somewhere. So the question is where, right? So what I have here is I have a few things that we could look at. So let's do console log. And all I'm going to look at here is the location. So we'll just go ahead and do window.location. Okay, so I refresh here, and I've got my window location. So I have where it is right here. We've got our path name. Ooh, path name. Interesting. And then I have my origin. So these, and as well as my host. So all of these things I can use to actually develop my WebSocket. But WebSockets have a different protocol than HTTP. So what I actually need to do is say var ws start, as in WebSocket start, or the beginning part of it, and that's ws//. That's it. So to actually make our endpoint, we can do plus window.location. Well, if we look at what we console logged, we see host. So .host. That actually is now a WebSocket version of this URL, but we still have to add in window.location.path_name. And this is actually where our WebSocket is. So that's our actual endpoint. But the problem here is actually when we go into production. So I always want to think about things in general, if I can, about production. So that means that if we look at our protocol, the protocol itself, we see that it says HTTP. Now, if we were in production and we were using a secure server, which I always recommend, you would see an S there. So the WebSocket then would have to be WSS. But if we're testing locally, it's going to be WS, so we need to account for that. And that's pretty simple. All we need to do here is update our code just a little bit and say loc equals to window.location. And then if loc.protocol equals to HTTPS : then we're going to change our WS start equals to WSS//. Okay. And then our endpoint is actually going to be WS start plus all that. And we'll just put it underneath to make sure our code is working correctly. And then obviously I could change this to just being loc. Or maybe not so obviously, but there we go. So we now have a way to connect to our WebSocket endpoint itself. Hopefully this code is simple enough for those of you who aren't that familiar with JavaScript. So we save this and we refresh in here. And I'm actually connected. Or at least I think that I'm connected. So if I refresh, it might take a second. And there we go. We actually get a WebSocket failed. We get an error and it closes. If we look at our terminal, we see that it does try to connect, but then it also disconnects. Cool. So the WebSocket actually is connecting. All of this stuff is communicating to each other, except we still have more that we need to do on our back end. But now we see that the JavaScript connects to the back end connects to the front end. They're just not doing it correctly. So we still have to do that, and that's something we'll do in just a moment. Stay with us. So when we did our WebSocket so far, only errors happened, right? It would close and it would say there's an error. The error is actually the backend. The backend has to connect to this WebSocket. It has to accept it. So let's go ahead and do that. Inside of our consumers, we now have to send back a response to our WebSocket, and we do this with all of the built-in methods. So something that is self.send, and it's a dictionary, and all we just do is pass in a type, and the type is WebSocket.accept. So this would, in theory, send it, but we actually need to use it as asynchronous code, so that means we need to await it. So doing await means that it's going to execute that code and wait for it to finish, and that would be await. So we save that. Now when we go back into our WebSocket, we now see that it's open. It's actually open and it's actually running. Really cool. So what is it that we want to see with our event? Right? It says it's connected, as we see. It didn't disconnect, it just stayed connected. That's pretty cool. So how would I actually connect it and then disconnect it? Right? So like, what would I do for that? Well, what I can do is I can use something like this. we say await and async IO dot sleep. And I'm going to go ahead and sleep, let's say, I don't know, 30 seconds. No, since we're recording a video, let's do 10 seconds. And then all I'll do is await.self.send. And then let's try WebSocket close. Okay. So it should connect. 10 seconds later, it should close. Okay. And again, await. So we refresh in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Isn't that fun hearing me count? It's probably really lame. Okay, so what it should probably do, and there we go. We now have it closed, right? Nice and easy way of having it close from the back end. So I opened it, waited a little bit, closed it. So this means that my actual WebSocket consumer is doing all sorts of things. But what it can also do is actually send something back to it. So I did WebSocket close, that just closed the connection. But I could also do something like send, and I can send something. So let's do some text, and I'll just say hello world. This time I'm going to get rid of that await method here. We'll save that, and actually that's why I imported async IO. I think I mentioned that it's because of these. That's not correct. It's just this. Okay. So I save that, and we refresh in here. And what do I see? Right there, I see that there's a message, and it says, hello world. Pretty awesome. That means that I can, right off the bat, I accept the connection, and then I send a message right off the bat. So this is where it's coming in. It's going back and forth here. There's still a lot more stuff that we need to do as far as actually sending this message and setting it up. But the main thing here is seeing that I can write a few lines of code to accept something or even to send a general message. So in the next one, that's what we'll do. We'll actually start to make this into a real consumer. Oftentimes when you use URLs, you can grab the path of the URL and you can grab the requested user. So all I'm going to do is this one is show you those two things. So the first one is we're going to get the other user, which would come from the actual URL path itself, right? So we just do self.scope, and this is going to be URL route, and then keyword args, and then, well, the username. So the keyword arg is coming from the route. That's this right here. Literally that. So if you change that name, you'd also want to change this. So this would give me the other user's username. And then me would be, well, it's just self.scope user. And then we can print those out. So other user and me. So we save that, refresh in here. And what do we see? We've got jmitchell3 and CFE. So jmitchell3 is the user I'm chatting with. CFE is the user I'm logged in as. So that gives me those two users. Awesome. So now the question is, how do we actually hook this into our database? Like, how do we get the thread that's related to these two users, which in our model, we actually already have a method for that. So this model itself will either create a new thread or it'll get the original one. So to do this, we have to actually create a method on how we're going to execute getting this data. So what I'm actually going to show you first is the standard synchronous method. And that's this. So we've got our getThread method here. This right here will get the username, or us, me, the user, and the other username. And then it's going to get that first value, so whatever the object is, right? So either way, it's going to send back an object, or that's what it should do. So that's what the consumer is. So this is getThread. Now this function itself is fine, except now we're using asynchronous code, so we have to use the decorator so we don't have memory leaks, we don't have too many requests, but we want to use the decorator database sync to async to actually grab what this getThread method is. And then that way I can go ahead and print out what that is. And all I do is thread obj equals to, well, self.getThread, and it's going to be me and other user, right? But And this is the big one, is this correct? Right, so are we actually getting the correct thread? And the answer is no. You have to use await here because it's an asynchronous method. So we have to use await for it to finish to actually get that thread object. So now I can just go ahead and print out what that thread object is. Okay, so we save it and we refresh in here. The only reason I refresh is because I want to make sure that the print statements are coming out on that connect. Right, so I have to reconnect is the point. That's why I'm refreshing. WebSockets don't need that, but I'm only refreshing because I have all these methods in this connect. But the coolest thing is here, we see that we actually have that thread object, so that means it is working in the way that we want it to. So we were able to get the user, we were able to get the URL parameter, and then we were able to use the database with this one. And again, database sync to async is critical when you're grabbing stuff from the database using asynchronous. Otherwise, you might overload your database, open too many connections to your database. There's a lot of things that could happen if you don't use that. So make sure you do. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. So we've seen how our backend can send a message to our front end. Of course, we just console logged it at this point, but what we now want to do is have our front end send it to our back end. Now, you may or may not know this, but the message by default already works. So if I actually send a message there, it does go to the database and it saves all that. So that already does work. So we actually don't want that action to be prevented if this socket doesn't open for some reason. So what I mean by that is if we go into our thread, and we look at socket on open, this is actually where I'm going to prevent the form from doing its default action inside of this actual method itself. The reason for that, again, is so the default action will still work. So if for some reason the socket's not connecting, the default action will still work and all of that would come through. So that's what we want to do here. Now, to do this, we need to use some jQuery to actually reference this form. Now, I'm using jQuery. You can absolutely use React or Angular or just raw JavaScript or pure JavaScript. You can absolutely do that. But, for illustration purposes, we're not focusing too much on JavaScript here. So now what I'm going to do is just say var form data, or just the form itself is $ID form. Okay, so hash form. This will grab this form element here. You don't have to know too much about jQuery here to understand that. All you need to know is that the ID name is form. So if I called the ID form data, I would just change it like that. So that actually grabs me that form. And like I said, I want to prevent the default action inside this socket. So what I'm going to do is form data, so that actual variable here that I just created, dot submit. We want to create another function, and I'm going to call this one event to change it from the E. So event.prevent default. Okay, so that just prevents my form from being submitted by default. So now what I'd actually need to do is send this data using the socket back to my backend. Now, without doing too much stuff on the form itself, let's just go ahead and just do socket.send and whatever data that I want to send. So let's just go ahead and say hello. Let's just put a basic string in here saying hello, or hello world like we've been playing around with. Okay, so all this means is I need to actually submit that form, and then it will actually send something to my backend. And since we're on that, let's look in our consumer and make sure that when we receive something, we are printing those things out. So when you send something, you need to consume it in the form of receiving it. We'll see what that does in just a second. So I save this and I refresh in here. That's probably not necessary, but I go ahead and run ABC. I hit submit. Now the form doesn't actually clear out, right? Because we prevented the default action from happening. But what we see here is we actually received some data. It actually came back to us. So all we need to do now is adjust how that data is being sent from our thread. Right, so I sent some whatever data. I didn't actually send data from the actual text or the message input itself. Okay, so right now what I have is this form, and it's rendering out an actual field. Now, there's a few ways on how I could go about grabbing that data, but I'm going to just do it on a very simple way for a specific reason. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to inspect the element on this message, and I notice that Django renders out this form with an ID of message. Okay? So Django renders out the ID of message, so that also means that I can do var msg input equals to $ID message. Okay, so again, we see ID message here, so we render that out. And now all I want to do is grab that data from my form. So we'll, above the send method here, send should maybe be last, maybe not completely last, but it should be up there. I'll go ahead and say var msg text equals to msg input.val. So this grabs the value of whatever that message text is. And then finally, I can send that message text back. And then we can also clear out the form with just form data, the 0th element, and dot reset. So that just clears out the reset of the form. So it resets the form for me. I could probably also just use message input value is empty, right? I could probably do that as well. So let's try out both of those things. I'm going to save that and refresh in here and say, hello there, buddy, whatever. I hit submit. It clears out the form message as we see, and it also sends out hello there, buddy. It also did send out hello there, so I said hello there. Perhaps that was related to a previous item. Okay, so we've sent that message through, and it's actually running. Let's do that other one with message input value being empty. I had just an empty string, so ABC. I hit submit. That also empties it out. So that, of course, we could play around with. But the reason I would do something like message data or this reset portion is if I wanted to include other fields on this form. And if I were to include other fields on this form, let's just go ahead and say form data serialized equals to form data dot serialize. And let's see what that looks like. So I'll just send that back to my backend. Okay. So I do ABC, I hit submit, and we get, I might have to refresh in here because I actually did change the HTML page. So if I change the consumer, I probably don't need a refresh, but when I change the HTML or specifically the JavaScript, I probably need a refresh. So that's why I did that. Okay, so I type out ABC, I hit submit, and I look at my console, and I see that I get two things in here. I've got my text with the CRS RF token middleware that's built into Django's features, as you know, and then also the message. So this is not that ideal, right? I would probably just rather have the message itself, and that's why I just use that message text. There is other ways to get that data from that form, but I'm just going to stick with this one. And then the other thing is I also want to just bring in this into as a dictionary. I want to send a dictionary back just so you know how that works. So I'll just call this final data, and I'll put it equal to a dictionary, and then we'll say message is that message text. And just to send it back, we would just do JSON.stringify that data. So you stringify the JSON data in order to send it. You want to turn it into JSON data, especially if it's a dictionary. If it's a string, it's no big deal. But if it's a dictionary, you absolutely need to do that. So last one, we'll say another exclamation mark, hit submit, and there we go. There's our message. So that means we'll have to do something with this, and that's what we'll do in the next one. So we come in here and we send a message. We look in our terminal, we see that our message is coming through here. That's great. So what I want to do is actually work with that message. So to do that, I have to actually turn my event data and grab what's coming through in there. And the things that are coming through are just simply this dictionary, right? So if I just pasted that in, I got my type, and that's actually how this method knows about it, right? So when you call a consumer, when you run things, different messages or events, the type automatically gets wrapped or mapped to the name of it, right? So the reason it's called WebSocket_receive is because it maps to the type of WebSocket receive. If you called it to, it would not map there. So it's pretty cool that it does that. The next thing is we've got this text here that's coming through, and it is a Python dictionary, right? So this is actually a Python dictionary, but in that dictionary, the text, that front end text, is coming through as a JSON string. We did that on purpose. We did JSON stringify that data. That's on purpose. So then on our back end, we can actually use a dictionary value of multiple things instead of just a string of things. That's the main thing. I mean, hopefully you know that. Okay. So what I want to do is then grab this text, and I'll say front text equals to event.get, and we'll grab the string of text or the key of text. Otherwise, we'll say none if front text is not none, meaning that key is actually in there. Then we'll go ahead and load it. So we'll just call this loaded data equals to JSON loads and that front text. Of course, I already have JSON imported here. So there we go. That should give us the dictionary itself. So this is actually dict data, right? So, or loaded dictionary data. And then our message is finally, I'll just say MSG equals to loaded dictionary data dot get message. And that will give us the actual message string, and we print that out. Again, it's not necessary if you want to just send strings themselves, but if you want to send more data, this is absolutely necessary. Like if you had other fields in there as well. And I mean, you might get in this habit anyway, because if you want other fields at any time, you could just quickly add it and not have to change too much of the back end. Okay, so we've got our printed message here. It should now absolutely work. So I do ABC, hit submit, and we should just see ABC here. And we do. So we received it, and then we see ABC is working. Cool. So now we have that message. I can actually send it right back, right? So if I cut out this await part from the connection, which I no longer need. In fact, I probably don't need these print statements anymore either, because that should be pretty clear here now. But all I'm going to do is echo that message. So this is an echo. It now says if I go in here and say ABC, hit submit, it actually should echo that message right back to me. So let's save it and refresh again and do ABC. I hit submit, and we've got that message event in here, and we see that the data says ABC. Cool. So it's echoing. It's working. Things are going in the direction we want to see. What we still need to do, though, is save that message to our database, which I'll discuss why in a minute. But we also need to, well, make this work with that other user. So if I refresh in here and just type out ABC, hit submit, I actually don't see that message coming through. So we actually do want that to come across on both of them. That's how WebSockets are really useful, is it gives that real-time communication to both users or any user that's connected to this WebSocket. So that's something we still need to do. Stay with us. Let's go ahead and display the message that actually comes through, like from the data in the backend. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into our thread.html, and we want to append every new chat item into this list. Now, I'm not going to worry about the styling. I'm much more worried about the data moving that around. So down here, I'm just going to go ahead and say var the chat holder, and we're going to do $, just like that. So that actually gives me that element, so I can append things, right? So I can just do chat holder.append and some list element here with the message, some sort of message, and closing off that list element. Okay, so how do we grab that message? Let's keep this commented out for a moment, and we can console log E. Okay, so we save that, refresh, and I just type out ABC. I get E. Now it's actually at e.data. So that should actually give us the message. Let's just use e.data in here. Okay, so we save that, refresh, ABC, hit submit. There we go. It's starting to echo those messages there. Now in this case, I mean, we actually don't need to worry about the echoing so much. as, well, I mean, I could already add this message up here. Right? So in many cases, what I would actually want to do is make sure that, yeah, I send that initial message. So it wasn't actually echoing. So when I do ABC, I should see it come up where it's ABC and ABC. Right? So it should come up twice. But I actually don't see a user here. The reason for that is back in our consumer, we're not sending a user. We're just sending basic text. So that means that we have to do the same thing to the front end as we did to the back end. In other words, we want to send that JSON data back with a dictionary. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and say my final data, or my response, whatever. So my response equals to, well, let's go ahead and just do message is MSG. And what else do I want here? Well, I probably want the username. Whatever user I'm using, I want that username. And you might remember from before, we used the scope here. So that's the user that's getting this data, which is me. And then I'm just going to go ahead and give a default username of, let's say, default. It's probably not great, but I'm going to go ahead and use it anyway. We'll say if user.is authenticated, which it should be, right? But there's a chance that it's not. Depending on how you set this up, there's a chance that it's not. Then we'll just go ahead and say username equals to the user.username, or rather me.username. But I'm going to leave it as user. So we pass that into my response. And then, of course, like when we sent it from our front end, we had to stringify the data. We have to do the same thing, but it's just slightly different in Python, and that's JSON dumps my response. So we now have a dictionary that's going to go to the front end, which we could console log what that is. Or I could just go ahead and say var, this is going to be the chat data, or chat data MSG, and that's going to take in json.parse e.data. So that's similar to Python, or Python's version of that would be loads. So that's the chat message data here, and now I can do chat message.msg plus, you know, like a space or something like that, and then chat message.username. And that should give us that whole thing. So I could say via that person. And then when I refresh in here, let's see, it looks like I got an error. I have an error in my argument list, so let's take a look at what that is. We have a syntax error. Oh yeah, I need a plus there. Okay, cool. Refresh in here, and I'll say hello there, exclamation mark. One actually gives me the user, and the other one gives me undefined. Did I spell something incorrect? Yes, this should be message. As we see here, right? So I actually logged that data already, and it is message. Okay, so I refresh in here again, ABC, I hit submit. There's the echo. There's the original message. Right, so like when I actually bring this on, I probably want to get what the user is. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll probably just add it in here as an item. So I'll do input type equals to hidden, ID equals to my username, and value equals to the user. Okay, so the user that's being passed by default, whatever that chat user is, close that off. And then I'll just go ahead and say var me equals to my username. Okay. And that means that down here, I'll just say via me. There we go. So now I refresh ABC. I'm getting object.object. Of course I am, because this should be dot username. And this should be dot value. Cool. Again, ABC. Hit submit. I don't have any spaces. Let's go ahead and add those spaces. But it shows us that, hey, this is the message I'm sending. This is the message I'm receiving. So again, ABC. And we can double check that by this response, just changing it to this is a instant message. and ABC. There we go. So the original one, the one that I send, goes first because that makes sense, and then the one after goes second. So of course we could put timestamps and all that stuff, but I'm not going to worry about that because it's just not really that necessary at this point. I mean, it's over-engineering this, in my opinion. Okay, so now what we need to do is actually connect these users together so they can actually send responses back to each other, and it's not echoing what I sent. We'll do that in the next one. Now, in order for us to connect any given thread, like this chat message here, to another thread like this one, so two different users, even on the same computer or different computers, in order for them to connect, we have to have a data store of the events that are happening. Meaning when, the user CFE is messaging jmitchell3 and vice versa, we need to make sure that we know that those events happened. Right? So I have all these events happening, but how do I make sure that the other one knows about it too? And to do this, we use something called Redis. Now, Redis is part of the installation process. So you might have already seen this, but essentially what it is a messaging queue for events that happen. Now, don't get it confused with messaging queue as in the instant messages that we're sending or these chat messages that we're sending, but think of it more in terms of the events that are happening. And it's just a long list of all of those events. And then what Channels does is can consume those events from Redis. So it doesn't always have to happen just on your WebSocket, but Redis can also do some of the communication for us as well. So luckily, just installing Redis is, there's not a whole lot more that we need to do there after you install Redis. Now, for a different, like if you're on a Mac, this will work. If you're on Linux or Windows, it's a little bit different. So make sure you look up how to actually install Redis. And if you're having a really tough time, please let me know in the comments because I'll try and put together something for you if a lot of you can't find ways to install Redis on your local computer. Okay, so now what I want to do is close out my project or my server, and I'm going to do pip install channels _ Redis. Okay, so this is a package that will connect channels to Redis. You might already have it, you might not, but I want to make sure that I do. I actually didn't have it, so that's an important part. I can go back to running the server again. The next thing I want to do is open up a new window here and just do Redis CLI ping. I want to make sure that's going, and also if I do Redis server, I want to make sure at least it's running or it says address in use, which means that it's already there. And we notice that we have this WebSocket of 6379. Or sorry, not WebSocket, but just standard TCP socket. Okay, so that means that I can connect to it there. Okay, so the next part is going into my settings file, and I'm just going to copy and paste stuff directly from the documentation. All right, so this channel layers configuration, that's allowing me to configure Redis. I just want to bring that in here and paste this. Okay. So Redis server name, in my case, I can actually use local host, and that should be fine. That should actually allow me to work with Redis itself. Now, if you're having issues with this, just look on how your system configures to your Redis server. So your system might be different. So, for example, in production, something that you might have to do is this. Right, so if you are using Heroku, for example, this should work for you. It might not, but it should. So I'll leave that there for reference, but this is how we use it on my computer. So on a Mac, I think Linux and Windows might also be able to use this just fine. It's just something I haven't tested. Okay, so now that I've got this, I can use more advanced things inside of my WebSocket, and that is connecting various WebSockets to each other, or in other words, making a chat room, right? So we need to make a chat room, and in order for us to make a chat room, we needed to integrate Redis. So now we're ready to do the chat room portion of this. So we want to create a chat room for these users. And it's only a chat room that's unique to these two users. In other words, we don't want other users to be able to get into this chat room. And we've already created the logic for that. So if you go into models.py inside of the chat app, you'll see this thread manager for the thread model. And the logic here is simply that only two users can be in this model itself. They are connected to one another. And the only way we actually grab that thread for those two users is this method here. So it's going to look based off of either username, and it's going to go ahead and find that one single unique thread, which means that in our consumer, we can actually verify this by doing me and threadObject.id. So if I refresh on either one of these, what I'll see is the username and the ID for that thread. So obviously, if I wanted to have multiple users in this thread, I'd have to do something different. But the point here is our chat room names have to be unique. And we already have a way to verify that they are unique by that thread object. And the logic behind here should ensure that they will be only one object for any given two users. It should ensure that. If you guys find a better way to do this, please let me know in the issues of this project itself. Okay, on GitHub. Okay, so we're going to make our chat room name based off of that, the object ID. So I'll say chat room equals to thread underscore, and then maybe ID. So we can use the format method for this. Or better yet, I could use the F string if you're using Python 3.6 and above. So this is now our chat room name. So I'll go ahead and say self.chatroom equals to chat room. Okay. Now what I also need to do is I need to use all this data before I actually connect to that WebSocket. I didn't have to do that before, but now I absolutely have to do that because I also want to do something called await self.channel layer dot group underscore add, and this group itself will be the chat room. So we can say chat room and self.channel name. So channel name is a default attribute of channels, but the channel name comes out only if you have your channel layer set up like we've already done. So back into our consumer, this now creates that chat room for us. And we've added the current user's channel to that unique name of that chat room. I mean, this name doesn't have to be unique. Like you could have, it has to be unique in the sense that you can have all of your users in this one chat room, or you can have it unique per user or per user group, like what we're doing here. So it does have to be unique in that sense. It doesn't have to be unique in the way it actually functions, though. But for this to work for us, it absolutely has to be unique to these two users. Okay, so now that we've got that chat room, and I attached it onto the class itself for a reason, we'll see that in just a moment, but I've now added this group in here. So what I need to do then is change how I do this response. So this response has to be to my users in a different way. It has to be to not just the actual WebSocket user or that one single user, but instead what it has to be is to the entire group. So we just do self.channel layer.group send now. And where are we going to send it? And what are we going to send? Or what event are we going to send? So all I'm going to say here is event equals to, or rather new event equals to this. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of that. We've got our new event here, and I want to send it to my chat room. So self.chatroom is where we grab that, created it when we connected. Now that we're connected, we can use it and then literally just send through our new event, which is this. It has a type of WebSocket send, and it's our response. So let's try this out. I'm going to go ahead and save it, and we'll refresh in both of them, make sure they're connected, open, no errors are happening here. That's a good sign. So I do ABC, I hit submit, and we've got ABC via and so on. Okay, so it actually didn't send the group like I would have hoped, right? So this might mean that I have to have a different method inside of this group send layer that then turns around and actually sends out the WebSocket for us. So what that means is I need to do async again. So async define chat message. And it's going to take in self and event. Now chat message itself is our thing. We just made that up. Chat message is not related to the WebSocket. It's just a custom method name that I made. So you could call it chat message event or just simply chat message. So in here, what I'll actually do is I will send what this message would be. So let's first off just call it and see what the message and event are. Okay. So down here in this new event, I'm going to get rid of that for a moment and instead use my own new dictionary and say type in a string like that. And this is going to be chat underscore message, the same name of the method I just created. And then we'll just go ahead and say message. Well, let's just say hello world. We hit save. All right. So now on our WebSocket receive, we should be able to get something going on there. I hit submit. Look back at my terminal. I see that it says hello world and it says chat message. So it looks like that message actually went through. In other words, this method is working. So since this method is working, what I want to do, this message is actually going to be this message. It's going to be that original JSON message. So again, look at the key here. Let's call it text. Let's leave it in as text as we've seen in other places. So now what I'll do is await self dot send. Okay, and that's going to be type WebSocket.send, and the text, well, what is the text? It's related to the event that's calling it, and this is the event that's calling it. So it's simply event text. So right here, this actually executes the message. So this sends the actual message, and this, in a way, broadcasts the message. The message event to be sent. So it triggers this function for all of the members of that group. In this case, it's that chat room. So I'm going to get rid of some of these other comments here. Save that. I could print it out and see what that works, but let's go ahead and refresh in here. Looks like I might have a syntax error somewhere, and I do. Line 52. Line 52. Oh, this right here. We need to get rid of that new event because we don't need it anymore. It's no longer a new event. But we're still sending that response, still going through, but it's being triggered in a different place now. So we save that. We refresh on these pages. Hopefully they're running again, and it is. So I type out ABC. I hit submit. Whoa! What just happened? Well, we get two messages coming through. One says this is an instant message via CFE, and this one says this is an instant message via CFE. So that's absolutely something that's incorrect, right? So my response should be the original message or the original response, which we called MSG here. Right, so I'm going to get rid of this. There we go. And then the next thing is, in my HTML, I actually don't need to have my submit method doing the same thing. Right, so this right here, I can actually get rid of because of how the messages work, which we'll see. If I refresh in here and say, hello there, buddy, whatever, I hit submit, it's coming through here. We actually have to refresh here because that was closed. So let's try that again. Sorry about that. And say, hey, hit submit. There we go. So it's coming in to both places and it's coming in near real time. We are really, really close to being finished. So stay with us. There's two more things that I want to do to polish off this project. One of them is actually storing this data. So if I refresh in here, sure, the messages are sent and they work, right? but as soon as I refresh either page, it goes away. So I want to make sure I do that. The next thing is, what happens when I restart the server? It actually closes my WebSocket. So I want it to automatically reconnect. Luckily for us, there is a third-party package that does that for us automatically. So that one's really simple. What we do is I'm going to just come into thread.html, just put in a script here, script source equals to, and I'm just going to copy and paste some code here. I'll show you where you can get this in just a moment. And then we put that script. That item itself, just a quick Google search for reconnecting WebSocket. It'll bring you here. You can find that code. You probably get the latest version of whatever it is. The next thing is actually changing the WebSocket to reconnecting WebSocket. And we bring back in here this part right there, reconnecting WebSocket. And that's it. It now will reconnect for us. So that doesn't mean that it's going to stay connected, like if the server goes down. But what it does mean is if I close out the server, it actually closes, right? And then I restarted the server. Hey, what do you know? It's back up. That part's cool. So that makes it a little bit easier than trying to figure out a way around reconnecting. It just does it for us. Nice, clean, easy. Okay, so the next part is actually saving this data. But you should already pretty much know what to do. And that's this right here, right? This is a hint for it. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that underneath here and just say create new chat message, or rather just create chat message. And what it's going to be is we've got our user and probably our message. So let's just say me and our message. And then we look in our model to see how we actually create this. Well, it's a very simple model itself. All it needs by default to make this work is thread, user, and message. So me as in the sender, thread as in the thread object, right? And then message, whatever that message is. So we already have me and user in here. Let's make sure we have chat message imported rather, and just .create. And again, it's going to be thread equals to thread obj, wherever that is. We'll figure that out in a second. And then it's going to be user equaling to me, and then message equals to MSG. Obviously those are the parameters that are being passed. Well, where's this thread object? Well, we actually have it when we connect. And as you see, we can add these things to the class itself. So we just do self.threadObject equals to the thread object. Cool. There we go. We now have our thread object here. So thread obj equals to self.threadObj. Let's give us some space here so we can see that a little bit easier. There's obviously a few different ways on how I could do that. I could use it based off of the scope, right? So we don't actually have to pass it as a parameter. Let's not do that. Let's just go down here and use it in as the scope. Okay, so get rid of that. And the last thing, all we need to do is the message itself. And where do we get that message? Hey, what do you know? My response. So await self.create chat message, just with the message. Again, we could pass the user in. Perhaps you do, perhaps you don't. It's kind of up to you on how you want to go about doing that. The only reason you would actually pass the user in, maybe not the only reason, but one of the main reasons is, putting it inside of whether or not they're authenticated. And that's the only way you would save that particular message to that user, right? So there's definitely things that you could go about doing this where perhaps you have your own model manager method that would handle whether or not that user is authenticated. That's getting outside the context of this and really just not that important. It's important in the scheme of making it work correctly, but it's not important in the scheme of how Django channels works. Okay, so if I refresh in here, which I didn't actually have to do, but I did it anyway. The reason I didn't have to do it is because, again, we saved that consumer. I saved it. It closes. It opens right back up, reconnecting for the win. And now I can say hi there. I submit it. Well, it looked like it closed and had to open up again. So hi there. We hit submit. Seems like it's closing. That's probably not a good sign, actually. So maybe reconnecting for the not win. So let's leave it as just the WebSocket itself. Refresh in here and try that again. Seems like it's not working. Ah, that's why. Me is not defined. We've got a server error. So let's leave that reconnecting back. Come back in here. Where is that server error? Ah, it's right here. So me, obviously it's related to that. I should have used user to create that chat message after I changed the parameter of how it worked. Okay, so now if I reconnect ABC, pretty cool. Obviously this one's not connected, but if I refresh in there, ABC comes through because I saved that in the database. And when we first go to this view, it will reload all of those items. So I say hello again, exclamation mark. It says hello again. Again, I refresh on both of these pages. Those things are absolutely there. And if I go into my thread object, I think I have it in line there. I see all of the messages in there as well. And to the correct user, right? So CFE user's logged in, and I say, what's up, slash CFE user. So all of that stuff is working correctly. We now have a chat application that is ready to go into production. That's not something we're going to cover at this time in this video. It is absolutely 100% covered in our course for this. So go to joincfe.com/courses and get a much more in-depth look at chat and channels, doing it, going live, doing WebSockets, and then also doing worker processes. Worker processes are offloading tasks like, let's say, for instance, you want to make an image thumbnail. That's one thing. Or if you want to do broadcast messages across all of these messages, like you are the system admin and you want to go to every chat room you have, that's another thing that you'll learn in there as well. But I mean, of course I want you to join that, but I think that you got enough here that you can now explore in the documentation on your own to implement those things on your own. That's how I did it. I think you can do it now too. But of course, if you want to save some time, just check out that course. Love it if you did, and make sure you subscribe to get everything. I'm going to be doing a lot more stuff on Django, some stuff on React, some more stuff on JavaScript, just all sorts of code stuff because I love software, and I'm super excited to share with you guys on how to do all this. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.